Shana Tova to all of you. I wish you were with us. I wish we were in person. But more importantly, I wish upon all of us a year of health, a year of safety, a year of well-being, a year of fulfillment, and a year for us of some movement, of some progress. And in this regard, I would like to speak with you. And I would like to speak with you using the words that you have spoken to me over the past few months, and remind you of some of the conversations that we have had. Have you, in the last year, in the last months, watched the news, considered a recent development, and thought to yourself, where am I? Is this really happening? Is this my country? Let me share with you some extracts of the conversations that I recorded, that I held with a number of you during the past few months. Do you remember meeting with me and telling me about your patient? Telling me that your patient learned from a friend that there was a carefully concealed computer chip in the COVID-19 vaccine. Do you remember telling me about your response to that patient in your office? Please tell your friend not to worry, you said. As long as you do nothing wrong, the government won't come after you. Remember this conversation leading us to doing some research in the spring, confirming that millions of people around us believed that COVID-19 was a conspiracy led by the government and the pharmaceutical industry, aimed at depriving us of our sacred liberties. Do you recall our conversations about the notion that following approximately 18 months of pandemic, millions of casualties around the world, and more than 600,000 in this country, if the CDC is to be believed, still only just over 50% of our country's population is vaccinated? Do you remember our conversations? Do you remember how we felt? Do you remember the unease you spoke to me about in the stores, the grocery stores, the restaurants, the airport, on airplanes, when people disregarded COVID-19 safety rules or refused to obey them? Do you remember telling me again and again, when you did not want to enter into discussion, disagreement, or argument? Do you remember 4 months ago the discomfort and offense that we spoke about following your being with some of your friends? You, yes, I'm speaking to you, you know who you are, who define yourself as a liberal, who told me you have struggled for liberal causes throughout your entire adult life, to discover that more than one of your liberal friends now describe themselves as anti-Zionists. Remember our conversation? And by anti-Zionists, we meant not merely people who are just critical of Israel and its policies, but people who are vehemently opposed to the very existence of Israel, believing that Israel's founding is the source of much of the trouble in the world today, and thus that by extension, those who support the existence of the State of Israel in any form, and remember, perhaps especially Jews who should know better, are guilty of supporting an immoral, indefensible political entity, guilty of the oppression of a colonial or apartheid state. You remember? You remember our conversation? Do you remember how upset you were? Do you remember the experience that you spoke to me about with regard to the feeling of being criticized, sometimes even shamed for expressing what you believed were legitimate criticisms of Israel among people who felt that Israel should not be criticized? Do you remember this feeling that you spoke to me about of being censored, as if a line had been drawn? Do you remember telling me you had decided not to raise the issue again? Do you recall you who came to speak to me earlier this year and explained to me in my office, we were masked and distanced, that you were a supporter of President Trump, that you deeply appreciated his staunch support for Israel and aggressive stance against China, but that you had serious misgivings about his role in the events of January 6th? How uncomfortable it was for you, that it felt as if there was no one out there to talk to. Do you remember? And do you recall the feeling of self-consciousness, discomfort you described to me when you said you had voted for President Biden, but were now increasingly concerned about his rush to negotiate another nuclear deal with Iran, about what you saw as overblown spending proposals, and having seen some footage of him, you're concerned about his general mental acuity and decision-making capacities. Do you remember telling me in my study how uncomfortable you felt speaking about these issues with your children because you felt that they would dismiss you as a conservative? Do you remember telling me you no longer wish to discuss politics with your children? Do you remember just recently the person who called me in tears, telling me how distraught you were about the new law passed in Texas, your fear that this Supreme Court would overturn Roe versus Wade, that you feared Ohio would not be far behind Texas? You told me, I can't believe this is really happening in America. You remember that conversation? Have you, in the last year, in the past few months, found yourself becoming either angry or frustrated, deprived of an association or connection with either an individual or group you wanted to be associated with at a moment when you could have sworn you had not changed your mind, you had not changed your position, but others around you did? The ground around you shifted. The dynamics around you changed. The country changed. The world changed. The whole environment changed. And you suddenly heard your own voice saying to yourself, how did we get here? Is this really happening? Is this America? This feeling I'm describing to you today, using some of the words you shared with me, this feeling of being removed, of being othered, of being deprived of an association or an anchor, of being undermined, the feeling of having to hide, of wanting to respond but wishing to avoid an argument or unpleasantness, this feeling that there is no one to talk to, that others will not understand, this feeling is alienation. I think, I feel, our sense of alienation is increasingly palpable. And the more alienated we are, the more likely we are to hide, to wear masks. And not of this variety. We hide, we evade, we negotiate our way. Cloth and paper masks can and will be removed when it is safe to do so. The invisible masks we speak of, they tend to stick. They become second nature. Sometimes we can barely tell they are on. They allow us to function, and they have the capacity to change us. Alienation is a significant force. Alienation is a burden. Alienation bears a cost. The authors and redactors of the Torah knew a thing or two about alienation. The Torah portion of Lech Lecha starts with a promise of greatness, of blessing offered by God to Abram. Remember the beginning of Lech Lecha? God says to Abraham, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha u'mibeit avicha el haaretz asher ar'eka ve'escha legoy gadol va'avarechecha va'agadla shmecha. Go forth from your land, you in the singular, from your birthplace in the singular, from the house of your father in the singular, El haaretz asher ar'eka, to the land I will show you in the singular. I will make you a great nation in the singular. I will bless you in the singular, and I will enhance your name all in the singular. No mention of progeny, no mention of children, no mention of second generations, third generations, nothing at all. The first time progeny comes up in the book of Genesis for Abram occurs in chapter 15 of the book of Genesis. Remember the beginning of chapter 15? God asks Abram to come out of the tent at night and says to Abram, look at the heavens, and promises to Abram that his progeny will be as difficult to count as the stars in the heavens, that there will be numerous people emerging out from the family of Abram. And then a deep sleep falls upon Abram. And during that deep sleep, we learn the first thing about Abram's progeny. During this sleep, God says to Abram, Da, ki ger yihye zar'acha be'eretz lo lahem. The first thing we learn about Abram's progeny. No, your progeny will be aliens in a land that is not theirs. Our entire Jewish identity is tied in to the notion of being aliens. The first thing we learn, the first thing we know about ourselves is that we are destined to be aliens. Now, the rabbis understand that upon reading this, we would immediately be tempted to explain it in terms of the period of slavery in Egypt. So Rashi's commentary immediately states, the text does not specify Egypt. It merely states a land that is not theirs. Lo ne'emar be'eretz Mitzrayim. It doesn't say Egypt. The 14th century author, Isaac ben Avraham Aboab, the author of Menorat HaMaor, a great commentary of the 14th century, uses this verse, making a reference with it to the exile in Egypt, in Babylonia, Persia, and eventually in Rome. What about these exiles in Egypt, in Babylonia and Persia, and in Rome? Whom did the Egyptians enslave, if not Egyptian Hebrews? Whom did Haman try to annihilate in Persia, if not Persian Judeans? Who were the people prosecuted and persecuted by the Romans, if not Roman Jews? In other words, alienation is ongoing. We are destined to be aliens. The words spoken to Abram by God are words that in part define our destiny. Being an alien for us is an existential condition. It is core. It is foundational to who we are. It is the very first piece of information we receive about being Jewish. Now, please do not misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that this alienation is a Jewish trait and that non-Jews cannot experience alienation. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, I am pointing out that for us, in the eyes of the biblical redactor who already understood and experienced alienation, and the rabbis, it's core. It's a main ingredient. And not only is it a main ingredient to being Jewish, it is a main ingredient to the experience of exile. In this way, it is definitive of who we are. Now, alienation is not about being a non-citizen in some country or having a foreign accent. Alienation can occur anywhere, in any country, in any setting, around the Thanksgiving table, at work, on campus, yes, even at a temple. Incidentally, the opposite of alienation is not inclusion. It is belonging. Judaism requires of us an appreciation and understanding of alienation and aliens to the point of even commanding us to love the alien in our midst. On Yom Kippur, we read the Holiness Code. There, the Torah demands of us that we see ourselves, our story, in the eyes of the alien. So, if you've experienced alienation in the last few months, in the last year, there is some good news. Welcome to the club. You are neither the first nor the last. You are not alone. Welcome to Judaism. Happy New Year. Shall we perhaps continue the service? Rabbinic Judaism requires us to examine and understand our human condition, to pay close attention to our sense of alienation, to the building blocks of exile. In the 4th chapter of Tractate Brachot, the rabbis discuss the experience of the destruction of the temple, the exile, and the separation between God and the people Israel. There they make the following statement. The rabbis taught, Tanu Rabbanan, Arba'a tzrichin chizuk, 4 elements need reinforcement. And they are Eluhen, Torah, learning, Ma'asim tovim, good deeds, Tfilah, prayer, worship, and Derech Eretz. Let us consider these for a moment. Torah is the kind of instruction, the learning that allows us to make sense of the world and that in turn directs us to greater learning and growth. Torah is that living discipline here of inquiry, appreciation for the wisdom of generations past. This kind of learning wherein we identify and internalize life's lessons and integrate them into our lives. A learning that leads to growth and enrichment, to a sense of elevation, to greater capacity for ongoing exploration. This is Torah with a capital T. The rabbis ask us to commit to this kind of learning and exploration, to trust that it can enhance our lives. In the face of alienation, in the face of exile, we must not resign ourselves to obfuscation. We must not resign ourselves to avoidance. We must learn. We must use our intellect. We must explore our ancestors' experiences of it, as well as our contemporary insights. We must shed further light on our experience. We can yet grow. Good deeds. In the face of so much alienation, so much isolation, we must not retreat. We must act. Do so for the sake of others. Good deeds are gifts to us. They reward us with feelings of value, of accomplishment, and they reinforce our connections and communal networks. Good deeds also have a multiplier effect. They reverberate and can lead to a cascade of goodness that follows. The performance of good deeds reflects and signals our commitment to others around us, as opposed to a narrow, perhaps even myopic, focus on our own well-being. Tfilah is a little bit more complicated. The English word prayer doesn't quite capture the notion of tfilah. It's not a suitable translation for the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word means evaluation, appreciation, and wonder, a sense of wonder. The Hebrew tfilah is introspective, meditative, and aims towards self-understanding and reinforcement in the context of the world and our place in it vis-a-vis our God. When the Talmud describes here Moses' prayer on behalf of the Israelites, it cites the psalmist's threefold prescription. Direct yourself to God, let your heart grow strong, and be of good courage. This is Psalm 27, the last verse. Kaveh el Adonai, chazak ve'ye'ametz libecha. In other words, our Hebrew prayer has the potential here to generate strength and courage within us. It is work that we do upon ourselves. It is intended to elevate our spiritual and emotional state and well-being in the face of challenge and fear. Torah addresses the intellect. Ma'asim tovim address others and ourselves. Tfilah addresses our spiritual, emotional well-being. It is a vehicle for emotional discovery, for identifying, naming, and understanding our emotions, for self-forgiveness, self-acceptance, and for the articulation of a commitment to ourselves, to our aspirations. And then there's Derech Eretz. Derech Eretz is also difficult to translate. It literally means the way of the land. Toward the beginning of Tractate Yoma, on the 4th page of Tractate Yoma, the rabbis ask themselves why it is that the book of Leviticus starts with the word Vayikra, meaning God called. Why does it start with that word? The beginning of the book of Leviticus says God called Moses, and then God spoke to Moses. And the rabbis say, why did God have to call Moses? Did God not know where Moses was? Surely God could figure out where Moses was. God could speak to Moses as God had spoken to Moses so many times before. Why did God have to call Moses and then speak to Moses? What was the reason for that? And the rabbinic response here is that calling a person by the name they use for themselves is a laudable practice. It's laudable behavior. Here, modeled by God, it is Derech Eretz. It is the high road. It is what we ought to do. There's a great lesson here. All too often we engage in speaking to people, to the world. We don't know whom we speak to. We don't know people's names, the names they use for themselves, the way they identify themselves, the way they see themselves. We speak to. All too often we do not understand their perspectives. We are unable to truly identify them. But true exchange here occurs when we are able to call upon our interlocutors by their true names, to dignify them with appreciation for their sense of self, for their sense of perspective. Here, Derech Eretz means more than speaking. It means engaging, respectfully, genuinely drawing in. This is the rabbinic prescription for addressing alienation and exile. This approach does not eliminate or reduce alienation. We will never eliminate or reduce alienation. But it will reinforce us and equip us with the ability to identify alienation when it takes place, to name it, and to start to appreciate its toll upon us, how it undermines our confidence, how hurtful it can be, how it may propel us towards a semblance, just an illusion of belonging. About 120 years ago, Ohio native poet Paul Laurence Dunbar composed the following lines. We wear the mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? No, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile but, O great God, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sigh, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. Are you ready to engage? Can we discuss the potential of learning and growth, of good deeds, of tefillah, meditation and introspection, and truly derech eretz, the courage, the integrity to call people by their true names? How long will we continue the charade? How long will we hide? Perhaps the time has come. Perhaps the time is now. 5,782. Perhaps the place is here, the Temple-Tifereth Israel. May it be God's will. May it be our will. May we grow out of our masks. Shana Tova to all of you.